Good morning. I hope everyone has joined okay. We'll crack on with the session, conscious of everyone's time. So yeah, thank you for joining us. Good morning and welcome to the first in our series of partner technical updates. Firstly, again, thank you for joining, taking the time out of your day. We're going to hear the latest from Microsoft. And for any of you that may not know me, my name is Daniel Well. I'm the Surface Hub BDM here at Tech Data Maverick. We are joined today by Richard Warren. He's the Surface Technical GBB for the UK. So we're very honoured to have his time today. He's going to run through the most recent OS feature updates that were announced for the Surface Hub. We're also going to hear what else Microsoft have on the horizon. This deep dive will give you some really good insights about why this update is so critical, and you'll learn what this means for the future of Hub deployments and why it's such an important time for Microsoft MTR and Hub customers. I'll pass over to Richard in a moment, but first, just some quick Teams housekeeping to help make the most of the session. We will be running a short Q&A session at the end of the webinar where you have the chance to ask you questions. Myself and Simon Hurrell, who's our Solutions BDM, will be online throughout to manage any questions that come in during the session. So please don't delay if anything springs to mind and submit using the chat window any questions that come to you as we go through. You will see here over on your screen on the right hand side the featured questions, and it's the speech bubble with a question mark where you can submit your question. Those are features are ones that we will publish. Obviously, we will see all the questions that are submitted here in My Questions. That's where you will submit them. We can't promise all of them will be published, but we'll certainly take a look and obviously look to answer anything that comes in by the end of the session. Before we get to the Q&A, at the end of the session, I'll run through and highlight the next series of events and webinars that both Microsoft and Maverick will be hosting in the coming weeks for both you, our partners, and also some that where we are looking to invite your customers to, well, they'll be welcome. And without further ado, and with that, I'll now pass over to Richard, who will start the session.
Thank you very much. I will just share my desktop, so hopefully you can now see my presentation. So thank you very much indeed. What we're going to be doing during this session is basically having a look at the Surface Hub. So we'll start off with a little bit of background, because actually a lot of the changes that we've made with the new operating system, and we'll talk about the new operating system, I suppose really for the majority of this call, but a lot of those changes are sort of predicated on the situation that we were in before the operating system was updated. So really understanding a little bit of the history behind the hub, where we are and where we sort of got to, where we've got to up until this point, really does feed in very nicely to what we're doing next. So as the guys mentioned, my name is Richard Warren. I am the M365 Devices GBB for the UK. So basically that means I am the Surface technical lead across the UK portfolio. So I've been working with Microsoft for 13 years, and obviously I've been working with the Surface Hub really since before we deployed the first version of the Hub V1, so a little bit over 5 years now. So without any further ado, let's get into the content and talk about some of the changes that we're making to this device. So the Hub journey then, we launched our first Surface Hub back in March 2016, and obviously that was the V1 Hub. It was a relatively basic device from a sort of features perspective, very much aimed at video conferencing, very much aimed at being the front of room device for your video conferencing and your audio visual requirements. Obviously at that stage we were using Skype as the predominant video conferencing technology. And obviously we had Office 365 installed onto the device as well. We also introduced the concept of a whiteboard and the ability to ink directly onto that whiteboard, and obviously use that during our meetings and during our presentations. So that's what happened in March 2016. And then towards the end of 2016, we installed the anniversary update, which provided us with a few additional features and functions within the device itself. Okay, but really the big one was in July 2017, which was our creators update. That basically brought us up to the Windows version 1703. So if you know anything about Windows version numbers, the first 2 digits are the year, the second 2 digits are the month. So 1703 was the March 2017 update, obviously, which we received between May and July. Now what that did is it added Teams. It also added the ability to authenticate onto the Surface Hub, effectively log into this device using our Office 365 credentials, which then gave me direct access to things like my OneDrive and also to collaborative technologies. So one of the things we started to introduce around this stage was the ability to do real-time collaboration between devices, initially between two hubs, and then we expanded that onto Windows 10 PCs and obviously iOS devices and web browsers and everything else that we now have in that portfolio. So if I look at the whiteboard as a good example of how that collaboration worked, the way the collaboration works is it's not actually part of the application itself. The collaboration is done through the Office 365 backend. So if we look at the whiteboard, if I spin up a whiteboard on a Surface Hub, what that does is it creates a local whiteboard file on the Surface Hub hard disk, okay, typically called whiteboard.1. And that's the file that we're going to be editing as we're working through this whiteboard during this session. But at the end of the session, what's going to happen is that whiteboard file is going to be deleted. As we know, when I finish my session on a Surface Hub, I hit the end session button, and that's going to clean this device off. It's going to delete the caches. It's going to reset the applications back to its original state. It's going to delete any notes taken during the meeting. Okay, and of course, it's going to delete that whiteboard. So the first advantage of logging on to Office 365, of actually using my credentials, is that suddenly that whiteboard file is moved from the Surface Hub. So when I log into the hub, the whiteboard file is moved from the Surface Hub into my OneDrive. And it's actually my OneDrive that's doing the collaboration. So it's not the hub, it's not the whiteboard, it's actually it's OneDrive, it's the Office 365 backend. The advantage of doing it that way is it means that I can apply the same collaborative technologies to all of my applications, all of my Office applications, okay, rather than having to build it in at the application level. So that gave me the advantage that not only did I have the collaboration, the ability to have up to 250 other people writing and inking on that whiteboard simultaneously and in real time, okay, and not just inking, but actually when someone is editing that whiteboard, their profile picture appears next to the area of the whiteboard that they're editing. So as you know, a leader of a meeting, for example, I can see exactly who is being engaged, exactly who is working and who is collaborating on this environment. The second big advantage, of course, is that this file is now in my OneDrive, which means at the end of the meeting, I'm going to hit that end session button on the Surface Hub. Okay, that's going to wipe the cache. It's going to set the applications back. It's going to delete my content. But of course, the content stored in my OneDrive is now persistent. So that whiteboard is saved into my OneDrive and can easily be reloaded in future meetings and obviously shared out or posted into Teams channels or anything else that I need to do with that. So that all came through in July 2017. So up until that point, you can kind of see the progression of this device. So launching at the beginning of 2016, a Windows update at the end of 2016, another Windows update in the middle of 2017, adding more and more and more features. And then we kind of hit an issue. And the problem was, if you then look at the next bullet point that we've got on this slide, which is the launch of the Surface Hub 2S, that was not until June 2019. So what happened in the interim? And this really speaks to the first issue that we're going to be facing with the Surface Hub. And I'm going to talk about this when we talk about the operating system update. But in reality, the Surface Hub has not received an update for Windows since that 2017 Creators Update. And there are reasons for that, and I'll discuss those in a little while. So from a history perspective, the next thing that happened in June 2019 is we launched the Surface Hub 2S. Now, this was a big moment for us at Microsoft because the original Surface Hub had been developed by an internal team at Microsoft that we had inherited from a company called Perceptive Pixels. So there's an organization that we bought in around about 2013, 2014 called Perceptive Pixels. And what they did is they built very large touch monitors, touch enabled monitors. Okay, and the idea is you could then use those within your presentations. What we did at Microsoft is we obviously bought that company and we kind of decided that wouldn't it be a good idea if we got these Perceptive Pixel touch enabled panels and we basically bolted a computer into the back of it and added some webcams and added some speakers and microphones and some other telemetry data and some other devices and basically made this an all-in-one device. And that was really where the Surface Hub was born. It was born basically out of Oregon, which is where Perceptive Pixels were based. Okay, the factory was in Oregon, and that's where we were developing these devices. If we are completely honest, we at Microsoft had no idea whether this device was going to be successful. Okay, and the reason for that is we were asking people an awful lot. If you think about back in 2015, 2016, traditional video conferencing, and the video conferencing that 99% of us were doing was very static. Okay, you'd walk into the room, you'd have the cameras, the speakers, you would sit at the desk, you would sit at the meeting room table, put your coffee down, and that would be it. You would be static for the rest of that meeting. You would be consuming content. Okay, what we were asking people to do was to ignore all of that, to even get rid of the furniture, to get rid of that table, to put a Surface Hub at the front of the room, to get up on your feet, to pick up a pen, to start collaborating, to start using that whiteboard. And that was something we weren't sure whether the market was ready to come along that journey with us. I mean, we were kind of confident, but there was always a question mark. So as we started moving through 2016 and 2017, the success of this device really started to come home to us. And we could see, in fact, some of the statistics here is that the Surface Hub is actually implemented in more of the Fortune 500 companies than any of our other Surface devices. Not in volume, obviously there are more Surface PCs, Surface Pros and laptops and so on out there, okay, but from a pure number of customers, we had more Surface Hubs into these Fortune 500 companies, okay, or more companies using this technology, okay, than we did across the rest of our Surface range. So it very quickly became obvious that we were looking at a device that was going to be successful. So our next decision was, okay, we need to modernize the hardware. We also need to bring this device into the Surface family. We need to make sure that this device is going to be part and parcel of our Surface offering. So we moved production, and we also had issues at the factory. The Oregon factory simply could not produce the devices fast enough. So the lead times on orders were just getting longer and longer and longer as we were struggling to keep up with the demand for these devices. So a decision was made to move production of the Surface Hub into our main Surface production factories, which allowed us to give us infinite, well, not infinite, but certainly much more significant scale, the ability to produce significantly more devices significantly faster. But it also gave us the advantage, and we're going to see why this is an advantage through this presentation. It gave us the advantage that we were now starting to use the same hardware components, the same processors, the same graphics chips, the same memory chips, the same BIOS or UEFI that we are using across the rest of our Surface platform. So it really allowed us to start bringing this device from this sort of niche device created by a sub company within Microsoft into the mainstream. Now, when we did the launch of the 2S, we were delivering a roadmap session at that stage, talking about the future of Surface Hub. And at that stage, the future was to launch the Surface Hub 2S in June 2019. The Surface Hub 2S is exactly the same operating system that we were using on the Surface Hub 1. So the software was not going to be changing. The operating system was not going to change. It was simply about new hardware. Okay, so a 5.5K screen, a much more updated 8th generation Intel processor, okay, and so on. And we'll talk about that hardware in just a second. The decision then, or the roadmap then, discussed the second device to arrive, which was going to be sometime in 2020, which was the Surface Hub 2X. Now, the Surface Hub 2X was going to be a redeveloped Surface Hub that was going to be cloud only, so it was only going to support cloud implementation, okay, but it was going to add certain features to the device. And the main features were going to be the ability to tile. So the ability to link 4 Surface Hubs together, or up to 4 Surface Hubs together, using DisplayPort daisy chaining, okay? And the idea then is that rather than running a single screen, I would be running my session across up to 4 screens. And they would act effectively as a single unit. So I could choose to run 4 separate applications on each of those hubs during the meeting. So maybe one running the video conferencing, another running a PowerPoint deck, another running a whiteboard, and a 4th one maybe with a browser window open. Or alternatively, I could span applications across those devices. So if I wanted to, I could create a whiteboard, for example, that spanned across 2 or 3 of those Surface Hubs in that group. Part of the reason why we wanted to do spanning and the ability to span these applications is because at this stage we had made the decision to produce just a 50-inch version of the device. When we launched the Hub 1, there were two options, a 55-inch device and an 84-inch device. The majority of the devices that we were selling were 50-inch or 55-inch devices, so the decision was made to use a 50-inch device and then to give us that bigger palette, that bigger space to work with by tiling these devices together. The second thing that we were going to be introducing with the Surface Hub 2X was the idea of biometric authentication. Okay, and again, we'll talk a little bit about biometric authentication as we move forward. And there were a couple of other features that were coming through. Then an interesting thing happened. We had a meeting with engineering, so the field guys, so me, my opposite numbers from the other countries and regions around the world, had a face-to-face meeting in Seattle towards the end of 2019, so September, October 2019. And we had the discussion that there were certain fundamental problems with the Surface Hub device. Okay, not the hardware itself, nothing wrong with the hardware, but there were certain fundamental issues that we were facing around the Surface Hub software and typically the operating system. And I'm going to talk about what some of those issues were, but they were becoming basically fairly major sales blockers for us. And for those organizations using Surface Hub, they were becoming more and more problematic. And really, it was about the fact that the Surface Hub operating system was just not playing nicely with technology that had really started appearing after we developed that first version of the product. Okay, and I'll talk about what some of those problems were and how we've resolved those problems as we move through the presentation. But we had this meeting with engineering and we said, listen, what we are intending to do is to add features to a device that has some fundamental problems. What we believe we should be doing is solving those problems first and foremost, getting every Surface Hub on the market to a solid, stable baseline, and then start adding features to it. And interestingly, for one of the first times, certainly in my history with Microsoft, we actually won the argument against marketing. It's very rare that engineering wins against product marketing, but in this case, we did. So the decision was then made to actually put the Surface Hub 2X on hold for the time being, okay, and then to look at addressing these problems. And that's exactly what we're doing at the moment. So the next bullet point on the slide is the Windows 20 H2 update, okay, and that's where we are today. And that is basically a new version of the operating system that we have developed for the Surface Hub. Okay, so that's really the majority of this call, is to tell you what we've done, what changes we've made, and how that's going to impact these devices. And then towards the end of the session, we'll talk a little bit about the future, where we're going with the Surface Hub, some of the new devices that are appearing on the horizon, okay, and some of our thinking around this platform. So before we go into sort of detail, let's just remind ourselves where we are with the Surface Hub 2 hardware. Okay, so it's a much slimmer and sleeker design than the original Surface Hub 1 devices. Okay, so the Surface Hub 1, the Hub 2 is about 30 to 35% lighter than the original device, which makes it significantly more portable, significantly more mobile. Okay, but it also means that from a logistical perspective, okay, for example, if I need to move the hub up between floors in a building, I could actually, well, if a couple of us were there, pick it up and carry it. Okay, we also change certain things like the aspect ratio. So if I talk about the screen, the original 55-inch Surface Hub was a 16:9 aspect ratio, basically widescreen, which is great if I'm watching movies. But if you think about our PCs, every one of our Surface devices, Surface Pros, books, laptops, Laptop Goes, Surface Goes, these all run at a 3:2 or a 2:3 aspect ratio, which is basically the same as A4 paper. Okay, which is why we use that aspect ratio. It's a much more natural way of working. You get a slightly taller screen, which means that when you're reading content, you get more content to see because you've got additional lines at the bottom. And as I said, when you're looking at producing documents, having an aspect ratio that pretty much matches the paper you're going to be using for printing, again, makes life easier. So we made the decision with the Surface Hub 2 to use a 2:3 aspect ratio. And you can immediately see this. If I present a Surface PC, if I mirrorcast a Surface PC to a Hub 1, I will have two black bars at the top and bottom of the screen, okay, where basically I'm pushing a 2:3 aspect ratio screen onto a 16:9. If I do the same thing now with the Surface Hub 2S and I push or I mirrorcast my Surface device, there are no black bars. I get a full screen experience simply because those aspect ratios now match each other. We updated the screen technology as well. The original 55-inch was a 1080p screen. This is we're calling it a 4K plus. It's a 5.5K screen. Okay, there is no term for that, so we call it 4K plus. We also on the original devices had high definition cameras. Okay, the camera on the Surface Hub 2S is a 4K camera, and we updated the speakers and the microphones to give a much rounder sound. Okay, so for example, if we look at the 2S, you've got two small cutaways at the side of the screen, which is where our tweeters are located, and in the compute unit at the back we have the subwoofer, okay, which gives us much better range as far as the speakers are concerned. A great platform for Microsoft Teams. So again, we designed this device really from the ground upwards to use Teams. That does not mean we no longer support Skype. Skype is still there and we can still use these devices over Skype just as well as we can with Teams. Or in fact, we can use them in a hybrid mode, okay, where I can have both Skype and Teams enabled, so I can slowly migrate as I migrate my organization from Skype to Teams, the hub can follow me through on that journey. We also implemented a new version of the whiteboard. And the whiteboard basically just added significantly new features, the ability to clean up my handwriting, to automatically generate tables on screen, to clean up any shapes that I was drawing, to use a ruler, okay, to add yellow sticky notes, to add those yellow sticky notes into a grid so I could then allow people in the meeting to vote on those notes, to basically put likes on them, and then automatically reorder those notes based on those likes. Embedding photos, embedding videos, embedding Word documents, Excel documents, PowerPoint slides, okay, and other Office documents into this whiteboard. So we significantly enhanced the whiteboard on the Surface Hub as well. We provided, of course, a much more seamless access into OneDrive, okay, and we made some mirrorcast improvements, and I'll talk about some of those wireless improvements as we move forward. There were a couple of issues, okay, again, this is a technical session, it's not a marketing session, so I'm going to try and give you as much of the bad news as the good news. But one of the issues that we faced with that new version of the Surface Hub 2S was that we actually lost the ability to ink on the device with two pens simultaneously. Now, the reason that that happened was with the original Surface Hub 1, if you remember, that was developed by this sub-organization in Microsoft, from Perceptive Pixels, and they used a proprietary touch interface for that device, okay, which they had designed and they had built, okay, obviously in their previous devices. That gave us the ability to ink on the device with two pens simultaneously, but it was just not compatible with anything else we did in the Surface family. Across all of the rest of our Surface devices, we use an N-trig architecture, okay, for our touch control and for our inking control. And what we want to do, the end game here, is to get rid of the idea of device-specific pens. So at the moment, we have a pen for each of our devices. The Pro X has a pen, the Pro has a pen, the Surface Hub has a pen, okay, for inking. But all of these pens are using a slightly different architecture. So by bringing all of our devices together to use the same architecture across the touch environment, it opens up the path to basically get rid of device-level pens. The idea, effectively, the end goal here is that you would have your own pen, your own personal pen, and that would work on any Surface device anywhere within your building. So you could use it on your PC, you could use it on the studio at your desktop, for example. Okay, you would be able to use it on your Duo, you would be able to walk into any meeting room or any meeting space in the building and use that pen on the Surface Hub that's there. But the first step in that was to migrate the touch architecture on the hub to N-trig, which is what we did with the Hub 2S. But, and this is where the problem comes, that N-trig architecture was of course designed for a personal PC. So it was only designed initially to support single pen input, because again, on a 12-inch screen, we really don't see anybody using multiple pens. Okay, so that was an issue then, and we'll talk about what we've done to resolve that problem as well. So we updated the hardware, so it's got an 8th generation processor. Most importantly, it now uses the same UEFI And for those of you who don't know, UEFI is the modern equivalent of the BIOS on our PCs. It uses the same UEFI as our Surface devices. And this is critical, and it's critical not just from a configuration, but from a security perspective. One of the big advantages we have on the Surface environment for the Surface devices is that we at Microsoft write our own UEFI. So everything within that device, from the silicon all the way through to the cloud, is created, managed, written and controlled by Microsoft. Now that gives us some really rather big advantages, and these advantages are that if we see there are firmware changes that need to be made, we can react and respond to that very, very quickly. We can get those device drivers updated, we can get those device drivers ready and delivered through the Windows Update process. When you're imaging devices, okay, rather than having to go to multiple manufacturers to get multiple device drivers to create your images, you go to a single location. So we had an environment where we have created this UEFI, we can be faster to market, we can develop drivers quicker, we can deliver those drivers faster, okay, and we can make sure that we are in control of that process. So implementing that in the Surface Hub allowed us to implement other technologies which have become very useful to us. So really, the Surface Hub 2S was about delivering this new hardware experience, bringing the Surface Hub up to a modern standpoint and ensuring that that Surface Hub had the ability to kind of be future-proof as we moved forward. So what do we do about those other problems, and what were those problems? Right, so let's start off with where we were before this software update that we're just releasing at the moment. So we were on the Windows 2017 build. So as I've already mentioned, that was March 2017. That was the last update we received for Windows on the Surface Hub. So if you're looking at a Surface Hub 1 device today, for example, okay, that has not yet received the new version of the operating system, you will be using an operating system that is basically 3.5 years old. The reason for that is because the operating system that we use on the Surface Hub was written specifically for the Surface Hub. It is Windows 10, but it's a flavor of Windows 10 that was developed specifically for that version 1 hardware. And what that means is we've ended up on a branch line away from the Windows development process. So although initially we managed to keep in step with the Windows Update process, okay, that relationship was broken in 2017. And the hub has simply not received an update, an operating system update since then. Yes, we've received antivirus updates and security updates and so on, obviously, but nothing from a feature set or an operating system set. So that means we were actually running an operating system that, if it were on a PC, would have been going out of support. So at Microsoft, we had to start generating exceptions to support that 1703 platform. So our first problem was we were out of sync with the Windows Update process because we were using this sort of special version of Windows for the Surface Hub. That also led us into other problems. We did not play nicely with Azure Active Directory. And again, the reason for that is Azure Active Directory really wasn't a big thing back in 2015 when we developed this original operating system. And what we see from a user perspective is really two aspects here. If I join an on-prem Active Directory environment with my Surface Hub, I get to choose which security group in my Active Directory environment manages and maintains the Surface Hubs. So who is going to be the administrator? Which group will be the administrator of these devices? When I do an AAD join, an Azure Active Directory join into the cloud, I get no choice there. The Surface Hub just simply uses the domain or the Azure's global administrators group to administer the Surface Hub. And that's crazy talk, because in reality, no organization's global administrators are going to be managing Surface Hubs. And those Surface Hub administrators need to be a global administrator for the Azure platform. So that was a problem. We also had an issue with single sign-on. And this, from a technical perspective, is all about the way we manage the objects in the background, okay, for Surface Hub, and it's about the way the hub manages its session objects in the directory service. But what you see from a user perspective is that the single sign-on process breaks. So if I'm on, again, on-prem Active Directory, I can log into PowerPoint, okay, and get access to my PowerPoint content. When I then open up Excel on the Surface Hub, it automatically logs me into Excel. When I open the whiteboard, it automatically logs me into the whiteboard. because we've got that single sign-on process working rather nicely. When, however, I am joined to an Azure Active Directory domain, that single sign-on process breaks. So we were seeing customers who were AAD joined basically being asked to log on and authenticate multiple times through each session. So I'd open up PowerPoint, I'd log into PowerPoint, I'd open up Word, and I'd have to log in again. I'd open up the whiteboard, I'd have to log in again. And that was really, so that was what we were seeing. The problem was how we were playing with with Azure in the background. We also struggled with conditional access. So with conditional access, for those of you who don't know, is the ability for a system like Intune, for example, to dynamically assess the condition of a device before it grants access to resources. And typically we use it for things like ensuring that the device is using multi-factor authentication, that the antivirus is up to date, that they've received the latest Windows update files, that their operating system is up to date. So it allows us to secure our devices, ensuring those devices meet a minimum requirement before they are allowed to then connect to our network and connect to our resources. And because it's dynamic, each resource can have a different conditional access policy. Okay, so I could increase the requirements for more secure content and decrease the environments for more sort of public content. Again, because conditional access really wasn't a popular platform when we developed this operating system back in 2015, the hub just does not play nicely with conditional access. And what I mean by doesn't play nicely is if I try and assign CA policies to my hubs, the hub will either mark itself as non-compliant, or in fact just simply not even answer the question. So the Intune system either flags the hub as a non-compliant device and therefore blocks it from accessing resources, or it just comes back as not evaluated. And fundamentally, it's because the hub doesn't understand what it's being asked to do. So as more and more of our customers were using conditional access, more and more of them were using Azure Active Directory and single sign-on, we had to solve those problems. We also were relying with the Surface Hub on some old protocols that a lot of organizations were simply not using any longer. They were back in 2015, but no longer using it. So for example, to synchronize the calendar between the Surface Hub and the Exchange server, in other words, to enable the ability to book the Surface Hub through Outlook, what I was going to need to do was to use the Active Sync protocol. Now, Active Sync back in 2015, 2016, was a very prevalent protocol. Pretty much every organization who used mobile devices was going to be using ActiveSync. Simple as that. So it seemed like a logical thing to do. However, over the last few years, as we've seen more and more migration to Exchange in the cloud, we've seen fewer and fewer people using this protocol. We now predominantly use an EWS protocol, an Exchange Web Services protocol, okay, to do that diary integration across our stack. But the hub was being left behind. The hub was still using that Active Sync protocol. So we needed to remove that. The hub also used only basic authentication. Okay, so basic authentication is an authentication process. It's typically done in background, okay, but that basic authentication is a protocol that allows me to authenticate against certain components. And we were using only basic authentication. We were not using the modern auth equivalent. In other words, modern authentication, we were stuck with basic. So here we were in a situation where the Surface Hub was struggling with Azure. It was struggling with conditional access. Okay, it was struggling with older protocols that customers were deprecating, were turning off. So we were going into customers and saying, look, to get the hub working, you're going to need to avoid Azure. You're going to need to whitelist it against the conditional access policies. You're going to need to re-implement basic authentication. You're going to need to keep these older protocols. So we were just having more and more and more exception conversations with customers, okay, about how to get these devices working. So we had to solve those problems. We wanted to get dual pen inking back in. Okay, we wanted the ability to do that. We wanted to add FIDO2 passwordless authentication. One of the things we'd always been concerned about was when you were logging on to the Surface Hub with your Office 365 account, you were having to type your password in on a big keyboard on a big screen at the front of a room full of people. And, you know, even without deliberately doing it, there are very few of us and I'm including myself here, who can actually sit in the room with someone typing in their password and not look at them doing it. And that becomes a security breach. So we needed to deal with that. And there were other functions as well. So we had this big meeting with engineering in October last year, and we made the decision that we would rebuild the operating system. So firstly, we would build the OS for the Surface Hub. So it still looks like the existing Surface Hub. You would be pushed to see from a user perspective any difference between the two platforms. So it is a version of Windows written for the Surface Hub, but, and this is the critical bit, it is basically written around the Surface Hub core OS, which means that it is a genuine and a fully supported version of Windows 10, okay, which means that we will now be back on the update train. We will be receiving feature updates every 6 months in the same way that the PCs are receiving that. We will be receiving stability updates every month in the same way that your PCs are receiving them. And we will be receiving security updates within sort of 24 hours, depending on the urgency of those updates. So we are back on that train. So from an IT management perspective, you are no longer having to create a separate update process for your Surface Hubs as you do for your Windows on your Surface PCs. Okay, we will be using basically that same fundamental core operating system that will get updated and will therefore be remaining evergreen, which is the big advantage of Windows 10. It also integrates very nicely with Azure. So our single sign-on problem disappears. I can log in once and I am now logged in across all of the applications on that device until I end that session, at which point my login credentials are removed, I'm logged off, and all of my profile data is then deleted from that device. Okay, so we work and we play nicely with Azure. When you join an Azure Active Directory environment, you now have the flexibility of choosing which security group you're going to use to administer these devices. We work with conditional access, so I can now start assigning and applying those conditional access policies. Now, be aware there are still some policies that just don't work on the Surface Hub because of the nature of the hub itself. Remember, the Surface Hub has its own user account, and the hub automatically signs in with that user account, and that's what gives it access to its calendar, okay, to the network and so on. Now, of course, no one is interacting with that user account. It is being automatically signed in by the Surface Hub whenever I boot the Surface Hub up. So assigning a policy for, let's say, multi-factor authentication to the hub is going to cause us is going to fail, because there is no mechanism of using multi-factor authentication unless literally every single morning you want to go into every single hub and manually go through a multi-factor authentication process. So yes, we work with conditional access, but the nature of the device means there are certain policies that you just wouldn't assign to the Surface Hub for logical reasons, and that's a good example of it. But other policies, is the antivirus up to date? Is the device up to date? Have you got the latest firmware drivers? Okay, have you got these bits of corporate software installed? All of that, yes, works quite nicely with the Surface Hub. So we no longer need to whitelist the hub against those policies. We have also removed any reliance on basic authentication. So you can now use Modern Auth across all of your back-end systems, across Azure, across Office 365, okay, across Exchange. And you no longer need that basic auth protocol to support the Surface Hubs. Okay, so that can just be turned off from your tenant, and again increasing our security here. We are no longer using Active Sync, or at least we no longer use Active Sync for diary integration. At the moment on this build, we are still using Active Sync to send email from the whiteboard. So if I'm created a whiteboard session, I'm not logged in, I'm just using it as a sort of anonymous Surface Hub session. I've created a whiteboard, I want to email that to people at the end. It is still using Active Sync to send that email. That should have been deprecated by this build, but I'll be absolutely honest, cards on the table, engineering just did not have time to get that feature into this build before we released it. So that will be Active Sync migration to Exchange Web Services will be fully completed in a future update, okay, as soon as engineering managed to get that code up and running correctly. So we can deprecate, get rid of basic authentication and basic auth. We still need Active Sync if we want to send email from the Surface Hub. But if instead we're not sending email, we're actually delivering those whiteboards by posting directly into Teams channels, okay, and we never intend to send that email, then actually we don't even need Active Sync at that point either. The device doesn't throw an error without Active Sync until I try and click the send button on the email, at which point it says this feature is unavailable. So if I'm never going to send email, I can turn Active Sync off and I just simply won't see errors on the device. I'm not going to get the device complaining at me. So those are the main drivers of the operating system, and those are the things that we've been changing. We've also added additional features to the device, and I'll talk about those as we move through this presentation. So what have we done? So in March, we started this process off, okay, with a beta. So engineering had been working through that. At the beginning of March, we released the first version of the beta. Now, that was released obviously to internal people, so everyone at Microsoft who had a hub at home, because we were facing lockdown at this point, pretty much globally, certainly across Europe and most of the US, okay, and we were therefore struggling to find people to test this beta. As you can imagine, to test the beta, you have to be on a Surface hub. For the majority of people, the Surface hub was in the office, which is exactly where they weren't. And therefore we were struggling to find testers. But we did manage to find enough organizations and enough customers and internal people at Microsoft and partners from people like Tech Data Maverick, who had hubs available to them in the office if they had exceptions to be there, or at home, who were prepared to do this beta testing. So we initially went out with a very limited beta in March. In the middle of April, we then opened that up to the Windows Insider program, which basically meant that anybody who had a hub and wanted to sign up to Windows Insider could then start testing this code for us as well. We then went through our final betas as we went through the summer, and then we announced the launch of this operating system at Ignite in September. So where are we with this? We have gone with general availability. So the operating system was put out to Windows Update because it basically uses a standard Windows Update process to deliver itself. We went out to Windows Update on October the 27th for Wave 1, and Wave 1 was New Zealand, Australia, Canada and Belgium. Wave 2, which was on November the 10th, so about a week and a half ago, was for the UK, for Japan, for Switzerland, for Italy. Wave 3 was for the US and Germany, and that's going to happen at the end of November. And then beginning of December, we then have Wave 4, which is everybody else. It's quite an interesting process. I've been in various different phased deployments. The reason we're using waves, by the way, is we did not want every Surface hub in the world trying to update itself at the same time and basically creating a denial of service error across Windows Update. So we phased this deployment out, and also to help customers who are multinational phase their deployments as well. So we made this phased approach, okay. That was available, as I said, on November the 10th in the UK. The interesting thing about the phased approach is that every time I've been involved with this or these phases with Microsoft before, the US is always Wave 1. It's interesting that it's Wave 3. Oddly enough, the decision about the waves was made about how well that country was dealing with the virus, and therefore how confident we were that that country would be back in the office in a position to accept the updates and so on. So it was made in a much more sort of sensible approach. Obviously, with hindsight, looking back at it, some of those countries probably should have been in different waves as second spike occurred and various other things. So, you know, we don't always get it right, but I think it was quite a sensible approach. So that means that the Surface Hub devices will start being offered. The Surface Hub 2 devices, the Surface Hub 2S's in market in the UK, are already being offered that 20H2 update. It's got a big update. It's about 7 gig. So it's typically an overnight process. It runs as an in-place upgrade. Okay, so basically after the upgrade has taken place, you are left with a device that pretty much looks exactly the same as the device you started with. It's now working more cleanly with those back-end systems. We also recognize there are certain organizations who would want to be able to update their Surface Hub outside that schedule. Either they're not connected to Windows Update, or they don't have Windows Update for Business, or they just want to manually do some testing and updating. Maybe they want to get their devices updated before the official wave for that country. So we released the BMR, the bare metal recovery image. Okay, the BMR is the Windows image of this operating system. Okay, and that was released for the Surface Hub 2S on October the 28th. So if you want to download that and use that yourself, it's a pretty straightforward process. You simply open up a web browser, search for Surface Hub 2S Recovery, and that will take you to the administration guide that tells you how to recover the Surface Hub 2S. On that page is a section around rebuilding the Surface Hub from a USB stick. Okay, that is the full instruction on how to implement this BMR. It's pretty straightforward. You download the image, you format a USB stick of at least 16 gig using FAT32, and you simply extract the image. It's just a zip file. You unzip the image to the root folder of that USB stick. You plug the USB stick into the hub, you turn it on while holding down the volume button. Keep your finger on the volume button until you see the Windows logo. You can release the volume button and the hub will then boot into recovery mode. And the first option it will give you is, do you want to recover from a USB drive? You click yes, and it just simply rebuilds the hub from that version of the operating system. So it's a pretty straightforward process. The actual rebuild takes about 30 minutes from beginning to end. The actual downloading of the 7.5 gig image, of course, takes a little longer. Okay, so again, that's something that's available to you. What I will say at the moment is we have, with this update, encountered a few problems with Hub 1 devices. Okay, now what we will be doing is every single Surface Hub in the world will receive this update. Whether this is a Hub 1 you bought 5 years ago, or whether it's a Hub 2 you're buying now, it doesn't matter. You will receive this new operating system. But at the moment, we had a couple of deployment issues with the Hub 1. So engineering are currently working on a fix for that. So the Hub 1 update will go live very shortly. And as soon as we get the information from engineering, we'll let Tech Data Maverick know, and they'll be able to communicate that out to you as well. Okay, so at the moment, we're updating all of the Hub 2s. Okay, and very shortly, the Hub 1 updates will then start running once engineering have solved that sort of final deployment teething problem. The advantage of that, by the way, if you think about it, that then gives us a brand new operating system on the Surface Hub 1. We at Microsoft will be supporting this operating system until at least 2025. So what that basically means is that we have now extended the software support lifecycle of your Hub 1 devices for a further 5 years. So any customers who have already invested, that investment can still be there. You can still make use of those devices, and we will still support them with feature updates and with security and reliability updates for the next 5 years. So we breathed a little bit more life into these devices. So that's where we are with the operating system. I'm going to talk a bit more about the features of that in a second, but I just wanted to also talk and sort of build in a little bit around the roadmap and where we're going. So we've now also made the decision. Now, do you remember back at the beginning, I talked about the Hub 2X, which was the device we were intending to launch this year. And that was going to give us a function called tiling. The ability to tile up to 4 hubs together using DisplayPort daisy chaining into what would effectively be a single device. Now, there were some issues around tiling. Okay, I mean, not issues, but there's some things that we've sort of rethought since we originally produced that roadmap. The first thing about tiling is that we use DisplayPort daisy chaining, and DisplayPort daisy chaining requires an updated graphics chip. So if you wanted to make use of the Hub 2X and you wanted to make use of tiling, you were going to need to buy a new compute cartridge for the Surface Hub. And that was going to be obviously an additional expense. And a lot of feedback we got from customers were, well, look, you're kind of selling us half the story with the Hub 2S and then expecting us to upgrade that later to the Hub 2X. Okay, we needed to do that, as I said, for the graphics chip update. So that was something we were always a little concerned about. The second thing, of course, is that the problem with tiling is that by using DisplayPort daisy chaining, there is a maximum length for a DisplayPort cable, and it's only a couple of meters, which means those hubs actually have to be very close to each other, if not act physically next to each other to be able to do this. So I didn't have the flexibility to have those hubs in different areas in the room, for example, simply because of the cabling requirements. And the other reason we were thinking about tiling was to give us that big canvas. Because remember, in the first place, we were only intending to release a 50-inch version of this device. Well, we've made a change to that decision, and we will now be launching an 85-inch version of the Surface Hub, and that should launch in January or February of next year, 2021. So we're a couple of months away. And then as we start getting closer to that, we'll make announcements about final release dates and when you can start putting pre-orders through for these devices. So fundamentally, it's the same beast as the 50-inch, it's just bigger. So it's the same operating system, the same touch interface, the same cameras, okay? It's got a more powerful microphone array because we recognize it will work, obviously, typically in bigger spaces. Okay, so we needed a more powerful microphone array, but fundamentally, other than that, it's pretty much the same hardware, it's the same compute unit, it's the same PC that we have in the back of our 50-inch devices. So that's going to be available at the beginning of next year. Some big changes to it, however, above the 84-inch that we had previously is the Hub 85-inch, the Surface Hub 2S 85 is 30% lighter than the existing Surface Hub 84-inch, the Hub version 184, which means that it is possible. For example, one of the problems we faced with the original 84-inch devices were they were very, very big, which meant that there were organizations where we couldn't get them into the lift. So if you wanted the hub on the second floor and we couldn't get it into the lift, we were kind of running out of options about how to get it up there. With the Hub 2S 85-inch, it is not only 30% lighter, but it's 11% narrower. And that's because we no longer have those wings at the side of the device for the cameras, the speakers and the microphones. Okay, they're all built into the unit at the back or at the side of the device. So 11% narrower and 30% lighter means that, well, it typically will pretty much fit in any lift now. So getting it up to the second floor is significantly easier because it'll go in the lift. And if it really won't go in the lift, a couple of burly people could happily carry this up the stairs. Okay, so logistically, again, we've made it easier to work with. We've done other things. For example, the packaging has been redesigned. One of the issues we had with the first, one of the complaints we had with the first devices was that the Ethernet card's MAC address was on a sticker on the back of the Surface Hub, which meant that if I was using MAC filtering on my network and I needed the MAC address before deployment, I was basically going to need to open the device up to be able to get that information off it. All of that is now not only on the side of the box, but actually the box is designed in such a way that you can see the compute cartridge without unboxing it, which means that you get access to the serial numbers, the MAC addresses, and so on without unboxing these devices. The boxes are also made with fully recycled and recyclable materials. So again, along with the other drives that we have throughout the whole of our Surface products about sustainability, also applies directly to the Hub 2 devices as well. So that 85-inch will be available beginning of next year, and we'll give you more detail as that date is finally nailed down. Now, this is an interesting one. We have certain customers that have requirements that the Surface Hub doesn't meet. For example, the Surface Hub does not run 32-bit Windows software. There is no Win32 subsystem on the Surface Hub. Now, that has been done deliberately. We recognized when we first built this device, we recognized that this was a device that was going into public spaces, into spaces that people could walk into and interact with the device. So we needed to reduce the attack surface of the Surface Hub. We needed to make it very difficult to break. And we did this by basically reducing the functionality and by removing components from the Surface Hub. So for example, the Surface Hub has no command prompt. I have no concept of elevated privileges. So there's no run as administrator on the Surface Hub. Okay, I have no PowerShell. I have no management console. The Surface Hub has no mailbox locally. It's set up as a room account, which means the Exchange server never sends it email. Now, if you think about the way that viruses and malware are distributed, one of the more popular methods for distributing malware is via email. If we never send the hub email, it has no opportunity to get that virus. It has no Win32 subsystem. Now, again, if you think about viruses and malware, the majority of malware for Windows is written in Win32. That's because if you try and write malware in Win64, it's too heavily sandboxed. It's too heavily locked away from the operating system to do any damage. If I really want to do damage to the system, I need to be running in 32-bit mode for my malware. The fact the hub has no 32-bit platform means that even if I could get the virus to it, it won't run it because it's not got the capability of doing so. I will not run executables. If I plug a USB stick into the side of a hub with an executable on there, the hub will not run that executable. Unless I physically log in as the administrator, it will not run it. I do not have the concept of side loading applications. So again, it's very difficult to inject malware manually into a Surface Hub because of these limitations. So with all of these things together, we've got a massively reduced attack surface for this device. And actually, it's one of the things our customers really love about the Surface Hub is that unlike other AV solutions, think about normal AV solutions. You put an AV solution into a room, and then pretty much on a weekly basis, you're having to go back into that room, replug the cables in, find the HDMI cable that somebody's unplugged from the devices because they knew how this thing worked, try and work out what's going on with the speakers, and basically rebuild that room on a fairly regular basis. With the Surface Hub, you can put that Surface Hub into a room, and our customers were finding that they'd put it in, and 6 months later, the hub was still doing exactly the same that it was doing on day one, because no one had the ability to corrupt that device. So why am I talking about that? I'm saying about this because there are certain customers where that just doesn't meet their requirements. So if you think about security customers, customers in national security, places like that, very security conscious organ, maybe financial institutions, they rely very heavily on things like VPN technology, virtual private networking. That's not available on the Surface Hub. So we could not use the Surface Hub in environments where VPNs were required. There are certain times where you really need to run 32-bit Windows applications. I mean, maybe I'm working in a team of architects, we're using AutoCAD, 32-bit AutoCAD to do our building designs. And I want to be able to collaborate on that work. Again, not something I can do on the existing Surface Hub. So we made the decision with the Hub 2, and it only works on the Surface Hub 2S devices, to allow you to install Windows 10 Professional or Windows 10 Enterprise onto these devices. Now, this became available to us because of the hardware changes. And remember, I spent a little time talking about the UEFI, the modern version of the BIOS earlier on, and telling you that because we wrote it, it gives us more security, more flexibility, allows us to control that environment much more closely. That actually gives us another advantage. The other advantage is there is a technical process called SEM, Surface Enterprise Management Mode. What that allows me to do is it actually allows me as an IT administrator to create a script that I can deploy onto a PC, onto a Surface device, okay, that actually edits and manipulates the UEFI through that script. So what I can do is I can use the script through SEM, S-E-M-M. I can use that to lock hardware out of these devices. So, for example, I've got a customer who wants to disable the camera. There's 3 ways they can do that. They can either turn the camera driver off in Windows. The problem with that is that anybody who knows what they're doing, the PC still knows it's got a camera because it can see the component. Okay, it knows it's there. It's just not loading a driver. So I could pretty easily get around that by loading the driver and the camera's back on. The second option, which is actually what a lot of organizations do, is they physically remove the component. Now, on a desktop, that's easy. You take the cover off the desktop, you unplug the component, you take it out. On a laptop, it's not so simple. If I want to disable the camera on a PC, for example, on a laptop, normally I cannot get into the laptop to remove the component. So normally these organizations would literally get a drill and drill the component out of the chassis. There is nothing quite so upsetting as seeing one of these customers take a brand new i7 Surface Laptop 3 out of its box, and before they've even turned it on, they are drilling holes in it. So because we write our own UEFI, what we decided to do was effectively through our UEFI, if you disable a component in the UEFI, we actually cut the electrical supply to that component on the motherboard. So if I go into UEFI and I disable the camera, the PC no longer thinks it's got a camera. That camera component no longer receives power from the device. It's effectively dead. It is the equivalent of drilling it out. Now, the reason I'm talking about SEMM is that we actually needed SEMM, this ability to change the UFI via scripting and to lock that down so those changes cannot be undone later unless you have access to the digital certificate that did the original lockdown. One of the first steps to actually get Pro and Enterprise working is to actually run a SEM script that edits the Surface Hub UFI that allows it to install an alternate operating system. So the fact that you can now start to see why we made the changes to the Surface Hub 2S. By using the same hardware as Surface, I can use the same technology, which opens up doors like this. So the process for 10 Pro and Enterprise is firstly, edit the UFI to enable alternate OS access for the Surface Hub. Get a version of Windows 10 Enterprise or Professional onto a USB stick, typically a BMR, a bare metal recovery process that we talked about earlier for the Surface Hub 2s. Insert that into the hub, boot the hub off the USB stick and install Windows 10. And you can install Windows 10 Enterprise or Professional. And what you end up with is basically a massive Surface Pro that you've just nailed to the wall. It's a fully functional version of Windows 10. It will use the same group policies, the same management mechanisms as your PCs. It runs the same software as your PCs. So why do we need to be cautious? We need to be cautious because we are opening up a Pandora's box. One of the big advantages of the Surface Hub for meeting spaces is that it is very difficult to break because of the reduced attack surface. The moment I put Enterprise on there, I am installing command prompt, elevated privileges, PowerShell, management console, Win32. It can have its own mailbox. So in other words, all of the things we talked about where we reduced the attack surface previously, okay, we now have to manage differently on this device. So think very carefully about where this is going to fit in your organization, if at all, okay, or your customers' organizations. So for customers who have project teams that run a lot of 32-bit software, yes, this may be a good idea. For customers where they have executives who are putting Surface Hubs into their own offices as personal devices, again, this will work well. Where I have specific security requirements like VPN technology, again, I can use the solution. But for a meeting space, a public area, a walk up and use, yeah, I would be very cautious about using this. I would be sticking with the original operating system. But it gives us that choice, that flexibility to use the Surface Hub in far more environments than we can today because of the flexibility of Windows 10 Pro and Enterprise. There are obviously Hub 2 accessories. I'm not going to talk about these. The Surface Hub 2 pen, okay, which is no longer rechargeable. It now uses a AAA battery. We made the decision to change that because we were just sick and tired of people putting the pen in upside down in the cradle and it not recharging. And obviously after a period of time, batteries stopped taking a charge properly. And we were just seeing the charge diminish over time, certainly as those Hub 1 devices were getting older. So we kind of looked at different charging technologies and eventually we made the decision, you know what, why not we just put a AAA battery in there? It lasts about a year, okay, it's somewhere between 9 months and a year of typical usage, okay, and then customers can just on their 6 monthly schedule where they're every 6 months going through and maintaining their meeting spaces, just pop a new battery in there. The Hub 2 camera is now removable. It's removable again, because we recognize there are customers who do not want to use cameras, security customers. There are certain meetings where cameras cannot be used. Previously on Hub 1s, they would be taping over those cameras with duct tape, okay, to basically stop them being used. With a Hub 2, they can just simply take the camera off, put it in a drawer somewhere. It also allows us to replace the camera if it gets broken. On the Hub 1, if you break the camera, we have to send an engineer out to strip the device down to get to the inbuilt camera. With the Hub 2, if you break the camera, we just simply ship you another camera. You plug it in. So those are some of the accessories. We've obviously got the steel case roaming stands. Those are the ones we partnered with during the launch. There are many third-party stands now available, okay, which give us other functionality. The steel case is very good. It's kind of like a flip chart type of stand. And for a mobile hub that I'm moving around the office fairly regularly, it's very light, it's very easy to move. However, it doesn't adjust its height, whereas we've now got height adjustable stands. Okay, stands with motors in where I can raise and lower the Surface Hub dynamically using the motor. Obviously got wall mounts, so I can mount these on the wall. And we introduced a few months ago the Surface Hub battery. That gives me up to 90 minutes of battery lifetime for the Surface Hub. It's not the kind of battery where I would use it to run the device all day off the battery, but it does allow me to move the hub from one location to another within my building without turning it off. So if I'm being kicked out of a meeting room, for example, I can take the hub with me, go back out into the corridor and finish my meeting off there. Or I could have a quick stand-up meeting in a location where there was no power. Okay, it takes just over an hour to recharge. These are built by by APC, American Power Conversion. So fundamentally, it's a UPS, an uninterruptible power supply for the Surface Hub. What other features do we add, or have we added within this new operating system? Well, this is actually in conjunction with the Teams group as well. We've added 2 new technologies around Teams integration. So these are called coordinated and proximity join. And we'll talk about both of these. Now, all of our Teams devices have a low-powered Bluetooth stack, which is basically a proximity detector. Okay, typically detects another Teams device within a 5 to 6 meter proximity. Because it's low-powered, it tends not to pick up devices in other rooms. Okay, so typically within 5 or 6 meters within the same room. Now, this is across the board. We have these in Surface Hubs, we have these in our PCs, we have these in our MTRs, our Microsoft Team Room systems. Okay, the little tablets that run Teams in kiosk mode for dedicated video conferencing rooms. Okay, we have these proximity beacons across the board. So why not use them? Okay, and that's exactly what we're now doing. So the first is coordinated join. If I've got a meeting room which contains, let's say, 2 Surface Hubs, or no, let's be more interesting, it's got a Microsoft Team Room system and 2 Surface Hubs. Okay, so I've basically got 3 Teams devices in this meeting space. I want to be able to obviously invite all of them to the same meeting. At the moment, I have to basically invite all 3 devices to the meeting. I've got to invite the MTR and I've got to separately invite the 2 hubs. And that's 3 devices I've got to remember to invite to my meeting. And if I don't remember to invite them, if I want them to then join the meeting, I've got to then, while I'm in my meeting, I've got to start manually dialing those devices in. And that's crazy. You think about it, for 99% of the time, when I book a room for a meeting, I want to book all of the equipment inside that room. Previously, we had to do that manually. Now with coordinated join, these devices know they're all in the same room with each other through the proximity beacon. Okay, so they can identify that proximity. If I invite one of those devices to the meeting, all of those devices are automatically invited. So it means I don't have to, if I invite the MTR, the Teams Room system, I don't have to remember to invite the hubs. It also means that I can then start being more dynamic. Imagine a situation where I'm in a meeting space, okay, that's got an MTR. I'm having a traditional sit-down video conference meeting, and I make the decision halfway through the meeting that I want to start doing some whiteboarding, some collaboration work. And there's a Surface Hub in the next room that's not being used. Great. Well, what I can now do is go and grab that Surface Hub, pull it into my meeting room. Once it gets within the proximity of the existing Teams Room system and the existing meeting, it will detect the meeting is in progress and give me an option with a single touch on the screen to automatically join that device into my meeting. So it means that I can pull a hub into the room, have it automatically join the meeting, and at the end of the meeting, push it back out of the room again, push it back away from the MTR system. And again, the proximity goes out of range and they are now 2 separate devices. Now think about where we were with the Surface Hub 2X and the conversation we had at the beginning. I talked about one of the features being tiling. The ability to link up to 4 Surface Hub screens together and use them in the same space. So again, the example I've got there is I've got one hub with my video conferencing, one hub with my whiteboard. Now with coordinated join, I no longer need DisplayPort daisy chaining to achieve the majority of what we were doing with tiling. If I've got 4 hubs in the room, they're all automatically added to the same meeting. They all join the same meeting at the same time, but they're all separate entities, so they can all have separate content. So I could have 4 hubs, one of them with a video conference, one of them with a whiteboard, the other one with a PowerPoint deck, and I've not had to buy a new compute cartridge. I've not had to run DisplayPort cabling. I'm now using Teams to give me hub tiling rather than updating the hardware and updating the cabling. The only thing I can't do at the moment is to span one application across two devices, because remember, Teams still sees them as separate devices, albeit all dialed into the same meeting. But it does hit about 95% of the tiling requirements that we were going to be producing with the Surface Hub 2X. So coordinated meeting, the ability for devices to coordinate and to join the same meeting because they are within proximity of each other. And as I said, that works with not just Surface Hubs, it also works with MTR systems. So you book the room, you book all the kit inside that room, and you don't have to remember to do that manually. We also have proximity join. Proximity join is more around being on a call already. So for example, I'm walking through the building and I realize I've got to get onto a Teams call in a couple of minutes. And I walk past a hub meeting room that's not being used. And I think, you know, I could really do with a Surface Hub on this meeting. What would I have to do today? I'd have to go back to the Outlook meeting request, which I might not own. And I'd have to ask the owner of the meeting invitation to manually invite the Surface Hub, or I would have to ask someone with the rights in the meeting to manually dial that device into the meeting. And I'm breaking my flow by doing that. Actually, I no longer need to do that. All I need to do is to be within proximity of that device when I start my Teams call. So if I've got a Surface Hub in the same room as me, as soon as I start the Teams call on my PC, it will detect that there is a Surface Hub in the room and immediately offer me the choice to use that. It'll say, do you want to join with your PC, or do you want to join the in-room technology we have detected? And if I say join with the in-room technology, it simply dials the Surface Hub directly into that meeting as well. Actually dials my PC in at the same time. So both devices are dialed in. So I'm now in the meeting on my PC and the hub, but it automatically disables the speakers, cameras and microphones on my PC, so I don't get that feedback loop. And in fact, I don't even have to do that when I start the call. I can do it dynamically. I could be already on a Teams call, walking through the building. I could walk into a room with a Surface Hub, and when I get to that proximity location, I get within the beacon range, okay, the proximity range, I can automatically, the hub will just spring to life and say, oh, I've just detected you're on a Teams call. Do you want me to move that across to the Surface Hub for you? So proximity join, using that proximity beacon, the ability for one device to automatically detect another Teams device within that small proximity area, and therefore to use that proximity to automatically join it to a meeting, to move my meeting from one device to another. And with coordinated join, the ability for all devices in a certain space to be automatically joined to the same meeting, okay, without any manual intervention from me, again, makes life significantly easier. So when I said at the beginning that we play much more nicely with Teams, that's what I meant, coordinated and proximity join. I have no idea why I've got the Hub 85-inch slide up again. One final thing to talk about then from a roadmap perspective, although actually we're just in the process of releasing this, one of the other functions that we were going to introduce on the Surface Hub 2X was the concept of biometrics, the ability to log in using your fingerprint. Now, we are not going to be using facial recognition. Okay, we can do it. We've got it working. We've had it working in the lab for several years now. It's not a technical problem. Facial recognition is a legal and a data protection issue. If you think about Windows Hello on your PC, where you want to do facial recognition, you choose to turn Windows Hello on. You choose to allow the device to scan your face to identify who you are and to use that for facial recognition. You are making a conscious choice to do this, and therefore you are implicitly giving permissions for your PC to do that work, to recognize and to store your biometric data. With a public device like a Surface Hub, our main concern is that that device, if I put facial recognition there, that device is going to try and recognize anyone who walks in through that door, regardless of whether they have given their prior consent for that to happen or not. and that is a GDPR nightmare. So we're not going to be doing facial recognition. We are going to be doing fingerprint scanning, and we have just released, or are in the process of releasing, our fingerprint scan module for the Surface Hub. It's basically a little finger. You can see the little nodule on the side of the screen there. Okay, that's a fingerprint scanner. It's a USB-C device, so it just plugs into the USB port on the side of the Surface Hub. A couple of things about this. We do not store the biometric data off device. So in other words, because the Surface Hub uses a TPM 2.0 chip, TPM Trusted Platform Module, it is the silicon in our PCs that we use to store security credentials and digital certificates. Okay, the Surface Hub has a TPM2 chip as well. Where we store the fingerprint data is we store it only in that local TPM. Now, what that means is, A, it's much, much more secure. Your biometric data is not being uploaded into the cloud. Okay, it's not being uploaded onto public servers. It is only staying on that local device. What it does mean, however, is that I'm going to need to register myself with every hub where I want to use my fingerprint. So this is not the kind of technology you would put into a public meeting space. You would still use usernames and so on, and dual factor authentication if you wanted to log in there. Okay. Where this comes into its own is going back, think about the Windows 10 environment, a Windows 10 enterprise environment. I've got a small project group of 10 designers who need access to a 32-bit application. So they're going to be using that Surface Hub day after day after day, just those 10 people. Hey, why not register those 10 people with that hub so they can log on using their fingerprint? Or I've put my Surface Hub into an executive's office, and it's the same executive is going to be using that device day after day after day. Again, register their fingerprint with that hub, okay, and allow them to use biometrics to log into that device. So that was the second function of the Hub 2X, was biometrics. So what does that mean for the Surface Hub 2X? Well, we certainly didn't release it this year. It is unlikely that we are going to release the Hub 2X in the shape and form that we discussed 18 months ago. So what that means is, remember, the Surface Hub 2X was going to be cloud only. Well, we recognize there are a lot of organizations who still have on-prem Active Directory, who still have on-prem Exchange servers. So we need that ability to run a hybrid environment. So that was a disadvantage of the Hub 2X. We were going to introduce tiling. Well, we can do that with Teams now and with coordinated join. I don't need an updated cartridge. I don't need additional cabling. The only thing I don't get there is the ability to span one application across two screens. We wanted biometrics, or biometric authentication with it. Well, I've got biometric authentication, albeit only on the 2S and albeit only in Windows 10 Enterprise or Professional mode. Okay, it's there, and we will be expanding the use of that as we move forward. In fact, the only feature the 2X was going to give me that is no longer available at the moment is rotation, the ability to dynamically rotate the screen between portrait and landscape. And after talking to a lot of customers came back and said, that's a really nice to have feature. Is it critical? No, it's a nice to have. So that's something we're working on. The hardware's there, the accelerometers are in there. We know when it's being rotated. There's just some work we need to do on the operating system to then support that. So that may well appear later. So we've got to the stage where we don't really need that 2X any longer, because the majority of what was promised is already now there without those updates, without those extra cartridges. Okay, and the few features that are not there with the 2X are being worked on. So that is my presentation.
That's fantastic, Richard. Thank you very much.
You are quite welcome.
So what I'll do now, if that's okay, I'm going to quickly run through what other training events and webinars that are coming up in the following weeks, and then we'll move on to the Q&A.
Perfect.
So, just thank you guys again. Thank you, Richard, for going through that. It's really comprehensive. I think all of us probably learned one or two things there with regards to the updates and what's coming next. But just to move on to what we have coming up. So, Simon Hurrell, our Solutions BDM has continued to run his secure remote teamwork webinar series. We're now looking forward to session 3, which will be on the 25th, and myself and Simon will be going through a hub overview and program update. And then moving into December, there is a Teams hybrid workplace session around the services and training and adoption, primarily in that 4th session. Also on the 25th, so we have ours in the morning. As I say, it's a hub overview and programmatic, but we also have, or Microsoft even, should I say, have a Surface Hub briefing event on the 25th. That will be at the end of the day, because Chris Luce will be joining us from Redmond to run through that. So you'll see a bit of a hands-on demonstration of the 85-inch and more information on the updates, which I think probably Richard's covered the vast majority, if not all of that, but a great opportunity to see the 85 in the flesh being used, and some of the sort of room solutions where that's used in conjunction with other machines in the meeting room. We'll make sure you get the registrations out to these events at the end if you've not received them already. Moving into December, Microsoft also are hosting a bootcamp around Teams meetings and devices. It's designed really for partners out there who are looking to either new or looking to build their practice around Microsoft Teams rooms. So subject matter experts from Microsoft engineering, they'll be focusing on what's new in their meetings, calling and devices, and building on previous boot camps that they've held. But a great opportunity there to again get deep on MTR. So moving into the Q&A, we've had 4 or 5 questions coming in so far. Please feel free to fire in any additional questions that you have. But I think Richard's covered one already there. One of the questions that came in is, does that mean the 2X has now been removed from the roadmap? But yeah, as Richard said, I think the functionality that was intended for the 2X about being fully cloud has, has kind of been postponed somewhat at this time because of those hybrid environments still being out there. But another question that we have, Richard, I don't know if you can help answer this one, but what would be, this is something that we get actually quite often from a partner perspective asked to us at Tech Data. But yeah, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this and just help support the partners out there. But what would be the best and most comprehensive list of prerequisites customers should consider before deploying a hub or even deploying a POC?
So from a prerequisite perspective, it's a very broad question, and the problem we've got here is that actually the answer is really broad. I mean, so to set up a Surface Hub, one of the primary things you're going to need is a user account for that hub. Okay, so that user account can live either locally, it can just literally be a user you've created for the device, or it can be an Active Directory user or an Azure Active Directory user, and it'll work quite happily with either of those two. It needs to be Office 365 enabled, so of course you need the right licensing, so you need to create an Office 365 account, and we provide all the scripting to do that. It's pretty straightforward. You're basically creating a room account, okay, is what you're doing, and setting the auto processing from there. So you're going to need Exchange to be able to book the device and to manage its meetings, and of course you're going to want Skype or Teams to be able to then use it. But what versions do we support? Well, that's where it gets really broad. So from a directory services, we can use Azure Active Directory in the cloud, or we can use Active Directory on-prem, or we can actually work with a hybrid federated environment for those organizations migrating from on-prem to in the cloud. We can also use use ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services. Okay, so there are almost no prerequisites from the user account perspective. From Exchange, we're going to need a minimum of Exchange 2013. So yeah, we support Exchange 2013 on-prem, 2015 on-prem, Exchange Online, pretty much everything since 2013. From a Skype perspective, again, we support Skype 2013 and above. So again, you could be running on-prem Skype 2013 or 2015, or you could be in the cloud, or you could have no Skype, or you could have a combination of Skype and Teams. All of those are prerequisites. So from a networking prerequisite, we don't use any traffic on the Surface Hub that isn't normal traffic. So web browsing uses port 80 and 443. Miracast uses port 1760. I mean, we're using exactly the same ports and facilities, the same proxy servers as your other devices. So you're not really having to do anything special from a networking perspective to get the Surface Hub running. So the bare minimum for a Surface Hub would be, let's say, an on-prem Active Directory with on-prem Exchange 2013 and on-prem Skype. And we could run the hub there. Okay. Now, there might be a couple of features that you might not have available because we're no longer in the cloud or you're not on Teams. Okay. But the whiteboard will work, meetings will work. You'll be able to do video conferencing. You'll be able to run other Windows applications on these devices. And we can go all the way through to a full evergreen Azure Active Directory stack running Intune for device management, okay, running on Teams, Office 365 in the cloud, everything absolutely the latest version, and really anything in between. So prerequisites, there aren't many. It really is things like, does your network have, in fact, oddly enough, the hub itself, because it just pretty much works. I'll be honest, and being honest is what we're here for. It does work with pretty much anything. The easiest configuration is where everything is in the cloud. The more complex configuration is where everything is on-prem. Okay, so just be aware, if you're going through a proof of concept where there's a lot of on-prem components, there's likely to be some heavy lifting that you're going to need to do to get the hub up and running in that environment. Okay, but it will work in that space. So most of our prerequisites really come from the skills that you as partners bring to this party. What are the acoustics like in the room? Am I going to need to add third-party speakers and microphones and cameras to this device? Okay, because that's key. We designed the hub to work in a space of about 5 meters by 5 meters for the 50-inch and about 7 meters by 7 meters for the 85-inch. If the room is bigger, or if it's a weird shape, or if it's in the middle of Whitehall in London and it's full of plush carpets and wood on the walls and Doric columns everywhere, you're going to struggle with some of the acoustics. So really the prerequisites are, do I have network access? Will the network support the Skype and Exchange traffic I'm expecting? To which the answer is almost certainly going to be yes. Do I have the right back-end components to support these devices? And considering we'll work with anything from Exchange 2013 and above, the answer is almost certainly yes as well. But more importantly, what is the space like? Do I have the right acoustics? Do I want to add third-party cameras, which we can do? The hub quite happily supports third-party cameras like the Polycom Directive, the Eagle Eyes, for example, things like Polycom Trios, there's a whole list of cameras, devices, speakers, microphones that we support. So really, that what we found over time is that the biggest issues around proof of concepts is customers not having the right space for it, not making the most out of that device rather than their back-end systems. We can work with almost any back-end system. It just gets a little more complex if everything is on-prem. Hopefully that answers.
That's great. I think you've almost answered one of the other questions there around the 85-inch, using a question in from Will, using the 85 as a front of room device in a large room. Is there an easy way to extend the camera and audio capabilities? Because as I understand it, it uses the same camera that comes with the 2S 50-inch on the 85. So for those slightly larger rooms, you would then, I guess, look to use MTR certified accessories and options for extending that audio and camera.
Absolutely so, and in fact it's a very, very valid point, because the camera we provide is a fixed focus camera, so there's no pan and zoom. It's not going to follow the speaker around the room and things like that. It gives us a view of the room, which is how we've designed it. So we work very closely with partners. Every few months we test another set of devices, and we release a list of devices supported by the hub. But as Daniel was saying, fundamentally, if you're looking at Teams certified devices, you're not going to go far wrong. So
Fantastic. Another quick question, one that I think I know the answer to, just because probably from a weight perspective and just the user scenarios, but will there be a battery for the 85? I'm strongly suspecting there's not going to be the case, because it's a much larger screen and probably a bit more cumbersome to be moving around. I think the purpose of the battery for the 50-inch was that, if you're in a scenario where you are overrunning in a meeting and the next people that are waiting, knocking on the door, waiting to come in, aren't utilizing the hub, you can wheel it out, carry on without having to switch it down, log off and re-plug it back in elsewhere. I think that's why the main feature of the APC battery was there. But surprised me, Richard, if that is something that you know of. But the question, will there be a battery for the 85?
So the answer to that one, simple answer, Daniel, is no, and that's for exactly those reasons. It consumes, that size screen running at 5.5K consumes an awful lot of power. Having said all of that, the battery, if you look at the battery that we use for the 50-inch, there is no additional cabling required. Literally, you now plug the power into the battery, and the battery simply plugs into the power socket of the hub. The 85 works in very much the same way. It's got the same power socket. So although at the moment the answer is no, we are not producing a battery for the 85, and no, we will not support the 50-inch battery for the 85. There is absolutely no reason why a third party may not develop a battery solution for this in the fullness of time. It's just not something that's on our official roadmap internally. So technically we could potentially do it, but there is no intention to do that at the moment.
Fantastic. And another quick question, will the Surface Hub run third-party video conferencing platforms?
Very good question. The answer is yes. So at the moment, we can already do that. When you install the new operating system, you can also choose to install the new Chromium Edge browser, which is the new browser we're putting out across. So it's based around Chrome rather than being based around Internet Explorer. But fundamentally, it is, still gives the same performance and security that we expect from an IE deployment. What we found actually is that Zoom and WebEx and Polycom work really nicely in the browser. So even today, if I've got the new operating system and I've got the new browser, I can just simply go to zoom.com and I can just simply dial into my Zoom meeting straight from the web browser, and it will use the camera, speakers and microphones of the hub during that meeting. However, we are also looking, we're kind of waiting for the Teams guys to do some changes at the back end, but we will also be implementing native support through the local client, through effectively the Teams client, into initially Cisco, so WebEx and Zoom, but we are also talking to Poly and to Google, and I believe even to Apple for FaceTime, although I'm not entirely convinced that that'll ever be done. But fundamentally, the answer is, so short term, yes, new operating system and new browser, you can just simply run those sessions directly in the browser and it works very nicely. And in the fullness of time, once we've sort of coordinated with the Teams guys, we will be adding that native support directly into the client itself. So a long answer in two halves. Yes, today through the browser, and yes, through the native clients, probably end of Q1, beginning of Q2 next year.
Fantastic, that's great. And one of the kind of slightly different question, but what would be the main differences with the operating system on the hub and the OS of WCD? I think from our, from our perspective, yes, exactly. I think from our perspective, it's what are you looking to get out of that room and that space from TechData. Obviously, we can support and supply guide around WCD, but it's very much from our talk track. It's a bring scenario where you're bringing the operating system into the room and utilizing the screen that's already in there, whereas the hub, it's built, built from the ground up on Teams and ready to use as a join device almost. I think you would have anything to add to that.
I think the interesting thing there would be, and you're absolutely, I do like the idea of it being a bring scenario. I've never thought of it like that, but you're absolutely bring the operating system into the room with you. I like that. I'm going to steal that, Daniel. But fundamentally, you're absolutely right. I think if you look at putting Windows 10 Enterprise onto the hub, that's going to be a much more similar experience to a Windows collaboration. Yeah, you're not going to need to bring the PC in because it's got a PC already built in. That's fine. And you can then just simply go up to the hub and log in as you, and you're up and running. So it's going to be faster. There's going to be less lag because the PC is simply built in. We're not using Miracast or wired technology to present. It's very dissimilar to the hub operating system itself. So if you think about the hub itself with the sort of traditional hub OS on there, it's a very different proposition from Windows collaboration displays, which are really about, as you said, projecting a PC. So I think if you're running in enterprise mode, you'll get a faster, more responsive, less laggy version of a collaboration display without the need to bring the PC into the room in the first place. But with the original Hub OS, it is a very different proposition. It is a dedicated device for that specific task rather than a much more open sort of Windowsy device.
Fantastic. That's wonderful, actually, Richard. Thank you again very much for your time. I think that wraps up the questions that have come in. So yeah, I think we can wrap up the webinar there. Again, Richard, really appreciate your time. Very thorough, very in-depth. And yeah, if you guys out there have got any questions, additional questions that you didn't have the opportunity to ask in here, please reach out to myself and the Maverick team. We are here to support you, and yeah, any of those customer scenarios that we can help navigate through and get the right solutions into those meeting rooms, please feel free to reach out and let us know.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for your time.